everybody, and welcome to our first ever in-person interview in the Thoughtful Faith studio. And today I am joined by my good friend, Jonah Barnes. Jonah.
Hello. Thank you. This is the inaugural interview. I'm honored.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm excited as well because now you have come to my hometown and you actually have gotten to know the glories of Reno, Nevada.
The glories, I know. People actually live here. I thought it was the butt of jokes. I thought it was we needed a good place to laugh about. I was flying over to come here, and it's like I'm looking down on Mars. I'm like, why do we spend all this money on rovers? We could study this. It looks like a nuclear wasteland. And then all of a sudden in the middle of it is the Jacob Hansen Oasis.
Yes,
in Reno,
the oasis in the desert, and you've come to my studio to be my guinea pig. Everyone, just so that you know, Jonah and I have spent a lot of time over the past day getting wires run and checking to make sure that things work here in the studio to make sure that this goes smooth. So thank you, Jonah, for helping out.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, the reason that we're having this interview is because you have released a book, and I happen to have been potentially the first person.
This is true.
To ever read it because you sent me the audiobook files to listen to. So I got to read it before everybody else.
Unedited. I sent you the raw, so you can hear it every time my kids run through the room and I'm like, quiet, I'm trying to record it. Yeah. You got the first peek at it. So
Yep. Yeah. Fantastic. So the book, I really enjoyed it. The book is called Key to the Keystone. For any of you who are watching, be sure to go and check that out. It's a fantastic book. Do you want to give people just the one-line summary of what the book is about?
Yeah. So the book is an exploration of kind of inexplicable parallels between recently discovered ancient documents and the Book of Mormon. It creates a theory for how these ancient documents could have matching or similar vestiges, motifs, themes, and words and phrases in the Book of Mormon. How could they be related to each other?
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fascinating book for a variety of reasons. But one of the first and foremost is sort of this idea of lost scripture. I remember when I was in the the 7th grade, and I went to an evangelical school. So everyone, if you want to know where I kind of got my start with apologetics, it was in the 7th grade because I was dealing with evangelicals who had a lot of issues with my beliefs. And I remember one of the big things they would always bring up is that you can't add to the Bible. You can't do that. And so I remember my dad showing me the topical guide. And he kind of was like, look, just go in there and like whenever they bring something up, you can find scriptures in the Bible to back up what you're saying. And one of them with the don't add to the Bible was lost books. And there's an entry in the topical guide for lost books. And all of a sudden I went, wait a minute, the book of Nathan, the book of Jehu, however you say that, I don't say it right. But I realized, wait a minute, how can they have this idea about the canon being closed? I always ask them, what would happen if we found one of those lost books?
Well, it's a little ironic when Protestants talk about how sacred the canon is, because their whole thing began with ripping books out of the canon, right? Luther literally just went, these are too Jewish, and discounted the very end of the Old Testament. He just said nope and took them out. So it's a little bit ironic when they're talking about the sacredness of the canon, because I want to say, okay, well, are you Catholic? Because the Catholics have a much better leg to stand on in that regard, and the Catholics don't believe in biblical inerrancy and sola scriptura. So it's a little strange when the sola scriptura crew accuse us of defiling the sacred canon by adding or subtracting, because the Protestants did that centuries ago and had no problem doing it then. So,
yeah, and so if the canon, if there's this possibility of lost books or lost scripture or even lost traditions that actually root back into history, it's sort of like, well, what if we found them? Right.
Well, the Bible mentions over 20 books that we don't have. So it'll drop those, like you read in the Lost Books and the Topical Guide. It'll drop a name like, oh, remember, this is all written about in the Acts of Solomon. And everyone's going, Wait, what's that? It's kind of. Do you remember the part where Nephi is like, I made 2 sets of plates, and one of them was I called the plates of Nephi, and the other one I called the plates of Nephi. And you want to just like pause and be like, okay, Nephi, that's a terrible thing to say because no one knows what you're talking about. You can't name them the same thing, Nephi. Like, what are you doing? It's the same thing. They drop this thing, Acts of Solomon. And then they move right on. And you're like, wait, what? Like, I want to know. It does that 20 times in the Bible. That's a lot. That isn't like there's 1 or 2 lost books. There's dozens of books that are mentioned that we just don't have. And so what the Apocrypha, when I say the word Apocrypha, some people think it's the Deuterocanon, the books that were taken out by the Protestants from the Old Testament. That's not how I'm using the word. Those are included. I'm using a much broader definition. These are books that are the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library. Any ancient book, any book that that comes from antiquity, that claims to come from antiquity, that has been discounted by, scholars, laughed at by religious biblical inerrantists, and I've looked through kind of all of these things, and many of them are nuts. Many of them are crazy. There's nothing to be gleaned.
Well, that's one of the things that a lot of people will say is sort of like, someone might ask, why should we trust the Apocrypha? Isn't the Apocrypha just a bunch of kooky, nutty stuff out there with no real relevance to us?
Well, it's kind of like saying, isn't this library got crazy stuff in it? You're like, the Apocrypha are so big and they cover so many things and come from so many places and times and languages that, yes, there are some things that are completely nutso. It's like the bar scene from Star Wars. It's like the cantina scene. Sometimes you walk in, it's just like, what are these books? Some of them are crazy. But some of them are very much not crazy. And many scholars and academics have looked these up and down, and they agree that this has just as much claim to authority as the biblical canon does. The only difference is that some monks in the 3rd century said, we like these books better. What I find is actually very fascinating that most people don't know. If you really look into why certain books were excluded and why certain books were included, the canonization process, okay? I know you've looked into this somewhat. Mm-hmm. You look at what was their reasoning? They come across the Book of Enoch, for instance, and they say, and we have their writings. They go, oh, this is kind of a cool book. Why don't we include this book? Tertullian will say, why don't we include this book? And they'll have a debate. And the answer that they land on frequently is, we don't include this book as Christians because it wasn't included by the Jews. Okay. And then you ask the Jews, why didn't you include it? And they say, we don't include it as Jews because it's too Christian. And you're like, wait a minute. So this is circular logic here. We're not going to include the stuff that the non-Christians include. And then the non-Christians, we're not going to include stuff that the Christians include because it's too Christian. So it's like, Christians, you're playing by their game. They're dictating your canon. You're not including Enoch because it's too Christian sounding, essentially. Mm-hmm. You are discounting things that are explicitly Christian.
Kind of sounds somewhat similar to what they do with the Book of Mormon.
It is.
They say, this couldn't have been ancient because it's too Christian.
Yes. I love how that bothers them so much. How dare this book be so Christian? But they have a good argument. So listen, the argument actually is a pretty good one. Christianity in its fullest form, with baptism, our suffering Messiah, resurrection from the dead, crucifixion on the cross, this stuff didn't exist until 30 AD, they reason. They say, you can, and the Book of Mormon is supposed to begin 6 centuries before Christ came, before John the Baptist came. And yet it's talking about baptism in Jordan. Right out of the gate, Lehi says, a Messiah will come, he'll be baptized in Jordan. They even mention John the Baptist. They mention the name of the virgin who will give birth to the Son of God. These are details, very specific details, that everybody knows only came out of the Christian era. No one pre-Christ could have known these things. And so scholars and academics look at the Book of Mormon's claims to pre-Christian Christianity and they laugh. They say, come on, this is fan fiction. This is ridiculous. This wasn't there before Christ.
Well, and to step back just a second from it. So you have this Apocrypha, you have crazy stuff, you have stuff that seems to correspond to Christianity or other things. And some might say, well, Jonah, yeah, anyone can go into the Apocrypha and just pick out the things that they like and then just end up kind of cherry picking. Right? What's your response to that sort of a critique that you're just cherry picking out of the Apocrypha?
This is a very common critique because yes, I mined over 40 different texts, some of them hundreds of pages long, to try to glean out these evidences for my book. So this is a good critique. Like, aren't you just cherry picking? So there's a few particular stories that I cite in the book, like when Adam and Eve hear about in the Egyptian book of the life of Adam and Eve, the first book. They say they hear about the suffering of the Son of God, that someday he'll come and suffer. And there's a little verse in there, someday the Son of God will come and he will suffer. Oh, well, you're just cherry picking. Somebody could have inserted that. How do you know your interpretation? Da, da, da. But this isn't just a verse that's inserted. It actually changes the narrative of the story. Adam and Eve, hearing about this, change their behavior. And they say, the Son of God's going to suffer for us? It isn't just a throwaway line. They react to it and change their behavior and start behaving differently and relating differently to God after this verse. It isn't something that some scholar has just inserted or something I've just kind of tried to glean information from. It's a whole conversation, and it's a monument in the story. It's a crossroads that changes the behavior of the characters in the story. Whoever wrote this book really, really believed that. This isn't me cherry picking. It's a fundamental characteristic of the narrative. And so sometimes I try to point that out because I can hear them saying, aren't you just cherry picking?
So what you're saying is that these things that are in there, they're not just like throwaway lines and little things that don't correlate well. It's sort of like there are patterns. Like, for instance, I think one of the ones that I saw in the book that I really appreciated was like the Adam and Eve narrative that we have has a ton of connections to apocryphal literature. And even that apocryphal literature was contrary to the Christian literature. So it couldn't have been sort of like, we're trying to make it more Christian, because like with the story of Adam and Eve.
Why would they do that?
They actually are making Eve into the traditional narrative is that Eve is kind of the bad guy. Right. She's the one who screws up.
Right.
But in this apocryphal literature, they portray her as someone who sees this as a necessary step. Mm-hmm. And then it's sort of like, well, wait a minute. So it's not that you're just like cherry picking an individual little parallelism that doesn't have because there's how do you know it's a legitimate parallel versus a parallelism, right? Like kind of a fake parallel. Mm-hmm. And I think that what I think you do in the book very well is you show that there are these themes that are consistent over time, and they're not in little minor details. They're in the macro story.
They're in the macro story.
And at times, like with Adam and Eve, these narratives actually contradict Christian doctrine, which would mean that if they were trying to make these older stories seem more Christian, it contradicts that.
That's not what you would do.
Yeah.
If you were trying to, because the fall narrative of it being this tragic, horrible thing, and that your fleshy body is a prison, like Plato's cave, shadows on the cave wall, that whole Hellenistic philosophy thing was dominant. It was all over the Greek, Roman, Christian world in the 2nd, 3rd centuries.
So could you be positing then that the ideas that we're seeing in our sort of modern interpretation of the Adam and Eve story are probably more rooted in the interpretive lens of Greek philosophers rather than out of the actual tradition that maybe predates those philosophers who later came and applied their lens to the text?
Well, the problem with this thesis is that it was impossible to really posit this 200 years ago because you didn't have any other voices. You only had the Bible. The Bible was the judge, jury, and executioner of antiquity. Anybody living in Joseph Smith's day, anybody living anywhere 200 years ago would say, you can read modern stuff, but if you want to read antiquity, you want to read about the ancient world, the Bible is the Bible. I mean, it is the authority on it, and it's the lone sole voice. So if the Bible says Eve is bad, then that's the way it is.
See, and that's funny because we don't often ask enough what were the competing traditions
Right.
of early Christianity?
Yep.
Because eventually there's sort of the group that became dominant, established the canon. Like, one might even ask, why did they have to establish a canon so vociferously?
At all.
Exactly.
Why did they have to do it at all?
It was to stamp out any competing traditions.
Yep.
And I think, now I'm not saying all those competing traditions were true. I definitely don't think that.
No.
But what I'm saying is they represent different strains of thought within the earliest Christian world, and that they, and so, and I think your book does a good point of this, that this sort of idea of competing traditions wasn't just a fact of, the Christian era, but of the Jewish era as well.
Right.
And so there's sort of an idea that people have is there's kind of like, there's Judaism,
Yep.
and then there was Christianity.
Right.
And what I think your book very well points out is that if we unshackle ourselves from the canon as the standard of judging anything else, and we apply a lens of like, let's just look at all of it, and then use, maybe for us in the Restored Gospel, the light of the Book of Mormon to then go back and examine all of it, we find that there's a lot more in those divergent traditions, oral and or otherwise, that eventually get passed down through some form into the apocryphal writings. Because you have to ask the question, where did these apocryphal writings come from? It's not like people just kind of, they're just making it up.
Came from somewhere.
But maybe what they were doing is they were, the apocryphal writings are corrupted versions of earlier traditions. And some of those earlier traditions, who are we to say? Jesus certainly showed up.
Yes.
And he had some opinions.
Oh, yes, he did.
About the reigning tradition.
Yes, he did. This should trouble every Christian. Every Christian should be deeply, deeply troubled by this, because Jesus Christ himself, when he shows up in the meridian of time, he has the greatest condemnation for the scribes. He's angry at the people who are keeping the Torah. And he says, your traditions are all corrupted and bad. Okay? So and then he, for instance, as an example that I use, he references Abraham. And he says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw my day and he rejoiced.
That's true. I didn't think about that.
Like,
That's a big deal.
Wait a minute, Jesus, what are you talking about, man? What are you reading? And I wish somebody would have raised their hand and been like, that's not in the Bible. Because it's not in the Bible, right? Now, the Bible didn't exist in 30 AD, but he is citing lost scripture. The Lord himself is citing a story that has been taken out, redacted from the canon. What other explanation is there? What kind of audacity does he have to say, oh, remember that story? And then he refers to the story that nobody knows what he's talking about. Okay, so every Christian should read that and go, wait a minute. Abraham saw the coming of Jesus. Wait, what? And be very troubled by that. And that's not the only example. Paul, Jude, John.
Well, and with Jesus and Abraham specifically, the people there didn't say, Jesus, that's not in the scriptures.
You're right.
Which
they didn't say that.
Which, I don't know, to me, there's sort of an implication that maybe they didn't bring it up because they're like, well, there are other stories about Abraham that they might not even be familiar with. Yeah. They knew that that the Abrahamic tradition is bigger than just the stories that we have in the specific sort of, like, the world of Jesus was a world without an official canonized.
Correct.
It was a group of traditions that existed within the Jewish faith.
We like to imagine them all having their version of the Bible. No, they did not have anything of the sort. Nothing of the sort.
And in addition to that, you have Jesus is calling out a corrupted Judaism.
Yes.
Which is very different, because that implies that perhaps at some day in the past,
it wasn't corrupted.
It wasn't corrupt. Exactly.
Right. Yes. And so these ancient books, so that's the premise of the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, if carefully read, It, from the very beginning, says the canon is being corrupted. The traditions are wicked. People are apostatizing. And so we need to get...
Lehi's Day.
This is Lehi's Day. This is chapter 1 of the Book of Mormon. It says the religious traditions are being corrupted. We need to get the truths out. Nephi calls them the plain and precious truths that are going to be corrupted. So we need to get them out and save them from corruption. Okay? So the Book of Mormon is built on this foundation that even back 600 years before Jesus Christ, people were trying to rewrite, recast, reshape what was considered doctrine, dogma, what the religion should be or shouldn't be. There was already a debate going on, which makes sense. It makes, of course they were. People always have been and always will. And that the bad side was winning. The Book of Mormon says the bad side is winning. Now, interesting, because 600 years in the future, that's just what Jesus Christ says. It's exactly what he says. He says, and as a matter of fact, and scholars, I point this out in my book, scholars say the reforms that were hot and relevant in the 7th century BC, right when the Book of Mormon says it was, those reforms that drove away the plain and precious truths in the Book of Mormon were the dominant religious climate among the elite during the time of Christ. They call them the deuteronomists or the Josiah reformers. That version of Judaism was the dominant climate in 600 BC, and it wasn't in 0 BC when Christ came. So Jesus Christ is doing the same thing the Book of Mormon is doing. The Book of Mormon is doing it centuries earlier. And so any Christian who really understands the mission of Jesus Christ should be thinking, what happened here? You can't, I don't think you can read the New Testament honestly without raising an eyebrow to the Old Testament and saying, someone's lying to me. Something's not right.
Something got corrupted, and that's an interesting idea, because what it does is it calls into question the possibility that that those older traditions that may be preserved within apocryphal writings. Now, my personal take, as I've read your book and I've read different things about the Apocrypha, is that you have to be very careful with the Apocrypha, because and my personal sort of take is that much of the Apocrypha is sort of the remnants of something that was originally core and good, right?
Okay.
Which, to a certain extent, that's what we believe the Old Testament is.
Yeah. See, that's it. That's really all everything is.
Yeah.
Right. There's no book that's perfect. One example is that I use is the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter. This was discovered in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Christian church survived. It is a very old church. It traces its roots all the way back to the very beginning of Christianity. And one text that survived with them is the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter. And in it is the story of the cursing of the of the fig tree. Now, this is a weird story. And good people have tried, and they do their best gymnastics to make some of these stories make sense, right? Weird stories in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and people are like, it was because figs were in season, but it didn't have fruit. So what he's really saying is he's saying that if you don't bring forth fruit in the season, and you're like, yeah, okay, that's one example. But the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter asks Jesus and says, why'd you curse the fig tree? And Jesus answers. And he says, oh, well, it's because the fig tree represents Israel. And I was teaching you an allegory about if Israel is the holy tree, actually an olive tree, that doesn't bring forth good works, good fruit, then it's not good for anything. And just being a member of the tribe of Abraham or the tribe of Judah doesn't do you any good. This is a big theme of Christ's ministry. Yeah. And so we're going to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, he says that is the full story. Now, why wouldn't that be included in the Old Testament or these old traditions? Right? And this speaks to this with all these apocryphal writings, the things that they all agree on, that they all seem to have in common, oddly, is they all seem to talk about there's going to be a Messiah, okay? He's going to suffer, all right. The Jews are going to murder him. Ooh, that's a sensitive claim. The Gentiles, those dirty, filthy, unwashed Gentiles, are going to get their chance at the covenant, okay? That's not something that the scribes of 600 BC would have liked, they'd have gone, they'd have liked to cross that out.
Yeah.
And they all have these common themes that are very uncomfortable truths to those scribes. And they all seem to have them in common. So you begin to see this pattern of, all these books that have been discounted by the scribes just happen to be the exact books that you would expect them to discount.
And then the scholars, though, they look at that and they go, well, those are obviously Christian themes. So those must have been created later by Christians.
Right. And here comes the circular logic of the scholars. I spend time on this in my book. They will look at anything that has Christian themes before Christ and say, clearly it can't be, clearly it's a forgery. Because Christian themes only emerged after Christ. You say, how do you know that? You go, well, we've never found any Christian themes before Christ. Wait a minute. But we just did. Well, no, but that's a forgery. Well, but how do you know it's a forgery? Well, because we've never found anything that has Christian themes before Christ. But you just did. Say, well, but no, we discount that. So wait a minute. So you just discount any evidence that doesn't fit the model.
See, well, it's interesting too, because if we look at Jesus and his relationship to traditions outside of the Hebrew canon, for example. Like people say, well, Jesus was a faithful Jew, and I think that is true. However, Jesus would do things that seem to go outside. For example, there's the story of Lazarus. The rich man and Lazarus, I believe it's the one where he goes to the underworld and like Father Abraham,
dip your finger and cool my tongue.
Yeah, cool my tongue. And that was, Jesus is actually reinterpreting an Egyptian story. Is that correct? Are you familiar
I've heard this. Yeah.
So what he does is Jesus is actually going to a tradition, not only outside of the strict sort of Bible tradition, he's actually going to an Egyptian apocryphal story. And he's recasting Egyptian characters as Abraham and Lazarus.
Yeah. Well, and Paul was quoting from pagan poets.
Yeah, and
Paul was quoting from pagan Greek poets.
Well, what it implies is that what if there was truth in some of those older traditions because they, in some way, maybe they had been bastardized and changed over time, but maybe they go back to some sort of a common root. And I know a lot of people right now with like Graham Hancock being a big deal into these, one of the weird things is you start to find certain themes, temple themes specifically.
Oh, sure. Oh, all over.
All over.
Oh, I could barely, honestly, when I found the temple stuff, I'm saving that for a future book. It's too big. There's so many evidences of it. The temple is a rash over the ancient world. It's a rash. And Jesus Christ had harsh words. Now, that's another thing that these reformers did. They centralized the temple. It was Jerusalem only. Sola Jerusalem is what they did. They said you can't worship outside Jerusalem. Now, who's the first? Now, Jesus Christ, the first person that he announces his messiahship to, who is it? A Samaritan woman. Talk about, oh, he was a good Jew. Was he, though? But was he? Okay. He goes to Samaria and speaks to a woman at the well and announces that he's the Messiah. Okay. And she asks, you say we have to go to the temple in Jerusalem to worship. That's what those reformers had done back in the days of Lehi. That's what they had done. Okay. They say you can only worship here solo Jerusalem. Right. And what does Jesus Christ say? He dismisses them. He says, no, that's nonsense. Don't listen to those Jews.
This is fascinating because what it also implies is that if they were writing Christian themes, temple would not be in the apocryphal stuff, right? Because the Christians, their view, the new Christians were very much like, hey, we don't need temple anymore. Temple's like not a part of this, we just throw it out. But so you kind of had two. What's funny is a lot of people think Jesus was saying get away from the temple. I think the better way to read it is Jesus was reacting to the Jerusalem only movement, the Sola Jerusalem movement. And then the Christians said, well, that means, or later Christian interpreters said, well, that means no temple, right? We all are temples unto ourselves kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas we as Latter-day Saints and the apocryphal tradition and the tradition and the, sort of the temple tradition anciently, which is wild, by the way.
Yep.
People should check out Greg Mattson's done great work on that and stuff. Where you can see all these themes in temple liturgies that it wasn't that Jesus wasn't saying no temple, but he was just rebelling against a corrupted temple tradition that had tried to centralize power amongst sort of the Deuteronomist, Josiah reformers, like let's centralize the power in Judah.
Yes.
And Jesus is coming to say, that's wrong.
Right. And who is the forerunner of Christ's coming?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Now, who's John the Baptist? He's the son of the high priest in the temple. The point is that John the Baptist was a call back to the pure temple. Okay? His birth is announced in the temple. His name is the name of the last high priest of the temple. John the Baptist was this foreigner. Everybody knew who John the Baptist was, that he was coming to condemn the false priests of the temple and get back to the purity of the pre-Hasmonean temple. Everybody in Jerusalem would have known that. Jesus Christ, the Christians who dismiss the temple are buying in to the sola Jerusalem corruptors, the very people that Christ was condemning. The very scribes that Christ was saying, woe unto you, you generation of vipers, the axe is laid at the foot of the tree. Who's going to save you from the wrath of hell, right? The very people Christ was saying that to are the ones whispering in the ear of Christians and saying, you don't need the temple. There's no temples today. Temples are all done away with. And Christians buy it. They buy it. And they say, yeah, we don't need temples.
So one of the things that I think is, just to kind of recap where we're at. So the idea here is we have these lost books.
Right.
We have these lost traditions.
Lost traditions.
We have a Jesus who's showing up and saying to the world, essentially, hey, these lost traditions, they are like, maybe there's more to them than you know. I'm going to kind of quote from some of them. I'm going to draw on themes from some of them. I'm going to rebel against sort of the established tradition as basically, this is a corrupt tradition you all have.
Right.
And so it makes, in my mind, maybe there's something to these older traditions. I'm not saying that we just go grab these books wholesale and be like, these are 100% infallible word of God.
Sure.
But there's got to be something in those. And then you find this not only supported by Jesus, but then by the later apostles, Jude, Paul,
John,
they're drawing on the Book of Enoch and other kind of what are considered apocryphal sources, which show that they show a respect to this sort of apocryphal tradition, at least in some way. And so suddenly there's a different vision. And now here's the thing though, for Latter-day Saints. So, okay, that's sort of the biblical tradition, and Christians, maybe they've been, if you go back, really that's what they were fighting about with canonization. It was sort of the fight over what of all of these traditions do we take as the infallible, in their case, the infallible word of God.
Right.
And what stuff do we say, no, that's all garbage? And so my sort of question then becomes, okay, that's the Christian predicament. What does this mean what does the restoration of the gospel and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon bring to this conversation?
Yes. And just a point of order, actually, the people who made the canon never said the canon was infallible. The people who canonized it were the Catholics. The Catholics knew there were other traditions and things outside the canon that they were fine with. It was later on that Luther and the Protestants made this bait and switch. And they said, oh, and this canon, it's infallible. And the Catholics were like, whoa, wait a minute. We made who says it's infallible?
Well, Catholics they explicitly say it's scripture and tradition.
Right. And so what's so bad about the infallibility of the canon argument is that the people who made the canon didn't think it was infallible. And the people who thought it was infallible didn't make it. So it's like you're taking the worst of both worlds.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I like that line.
It's bizarre.
Yeah, people need to note that. That one down, clip that clip.
Yeah. But so to your point about Latter-day Saints. So in the Book of Mormon, it starts off and it says the canon is corrupt. The people of Jerusalem are falling. We need to get the plain and precious truths out. Okay. Not a few chapters later, it talks about the corruption of these plain and precious truths. And it says that someday new books will be found. Someday new records will come forth. Okay. Now, the Book of Mormon was written in 1829. At that time, there were no apocrypha. There was the Deuterocanon, which the Protestants had taken out, which, by the way, in my book, I don't think I cite a single verse from the Deuterocanon, okay? So we're not talking about that. There was nothing available to Joseph Smith at that time. There was the Bible, okay? The Book of Enoch was kind of the first candidate. Some people will say, oh, didn't he have the Book of Enoch? The Ethiopian Book of Enoch was first translated into English in 1821 in London. It was printed 2.5 copies for a couple, monocle-wearing academics in their ivory towers to look at, okay? And they actually the publishers comment, and I cite this in the book, is they say, in 1838, they say, wouldn't you know it, somebody in America wants a copy of the Book of Enoch. So it was remarkable enough for them to say, someone in America wants this book, let's send it. So the point is, none of these things existed in America or anywhere.
So just to set up the scenario that I can see you're driving towards, and that you do drive at in the book, obviously, is, okay, what happens? What are we to make if we end up finding these apocryphal traditions in the Book of Mormon, considering that those books weren't even around?
The Book of Mormon predicts them. Impossibly predicts them. It says crazy things that people laughed at the time because there was no other witness. The only witness was the Bible. What I like to liken it to is Rapunzel. I have little girls, and they love Disney princesses. And in Rapunzel, she's trapped in this tower, and Mother Gothel is her mother, and she trusts her mother, and she says, "You're my mother. You're where I come from, and I'll do whatever you say, and whatever." And that's all she knows. Then some intrepid adventurer, who I imagine looks like a young Jacob Hansen, just blonde, super buff, comes climbing up the tower.
Exactly.
And he says, "You've been lied to. You've been lied to. This isn't your mother. There's more to the world." And her world just shatters. Her paradigm just boom. The Bible's all we had. And then so the Book of Mormon comes and says, there's a world beyond this. And people go, "Oh, you're crazy. What are you talking about?" But then the Apocrypha starts showing up. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jasher, the Apocalypse of Moses, the Latin Vita Adami Dei, the Armenian traditions, the Coptic, the Ethiopic.
Well,
all these things start.
And some people would say, though, that, the Book of Mormon is just another pseudepigraphal late work created by someone.
Okay.
It's essentially the newest version of apocryphal literature that's been created by people out there.
Okay, now hold on a minute. Not the newest version, the first version. So if the Book of Mormon if it's an apocrypha, it's pseudepigrapha, it is the first pseudepigrapha. There was nothing like this. There was nothing to compare it to. The Book of Mormon was the first one on the scene to say, "Hey, there's other ancient traditions besides the Bible, you know." It was
at least in any big way, obviously within the Christian world. And I think what is, again, it's the shocking question. It's sort of like a test, right? It's like, okay, we can test the Book of Mormon here. Or I guess maybe I would put it this way. I'd have to ask the critic, why is it that there are so many apocryphal themes showing up in this book? Because what they end up doing, is, so far as I can tell, is you end up setting up with the two witnesses.
Binary, right.
Right? When we only had the Bible to compare it to.
Right.
You only have one sort of standard to check it with. That doesn't fit with that, therefore it's out of bounds. But what if you have the Book of Mormon, and it is indeed inspired scripture? Now, for Latter-day Saints, we have a different lens that we can look at it through. We can analyze the Apocrypha through the lens of both.
Yes.
And I think, and this is why I want everyone to go get your book, is because you show that there is not only is there apocryphal stuff in the Book of Mormon, there is a really interesting, plausible theory, if the Book of Mormon is true, it's just another level of complexity, for why these things throw up in the Book of Mormon and how they got there.
Right, is what happened. And that's the natural question. When you look at canonization, honestly, I think if you look at it honestly, and all these apocryphal works saying, they're like ransom notes. They're all saying, You're being lied to. Help. They're coming. Drums in the deep. They're all saying, trust me, trust. No. And they're all getting cast out by the canonizers. After you look at all this stuff, I think an honest person has to say, how could God let this happen? How could this happen? What happened that it could be so corrupted? It's kind of an unbearable truth to face.
Well,
and what in the book, I think I try to lay out the theory for, well, this is not only is this how I think it happened, I think this is the only way it could have ever happened. Like, it had to happen this way. The mission of it changes your perspective on the mission of the Book of Mormon. You see these vestiges of the Apocrypha pop up impossibly. The Apocrypha is predicting things.
It's like the again, to go back to your Rapunzel analogy, it's like Mother Gossel's been telling her, hey, this is your whole world, and then all of a sudden a message comes in that says, hey, maybe there's something outside of the tower,
right,
that exists. And then, and you use I love this analogy of the book. It's one of my favorite parts in the book, is the analogy to DNA and family relationships. Because we talked about this at breakfast this morning. There is a...
Just so you know, Jacob Hansen consumes an entire roasted pig every day for breakfast. It's amazing. It's amazing to watch. Just a whole huge roasted pig.
And Jonah is quite generous and paid for that roasted pig this morning. So, but it was... So there was... this, so I know there's sort of a term out there. It's the genealogy of ideas, right?
Yes.
Your ideas don't just come to you from nowhere. Okay. Mm-hmm. They just don't. Every idea and theme, you can trace it back to try and find out where it came from. And I've done this with, for instance, one of the things I've really studied lately is sort of the modern woke ideology and where its roots go back into neo-Marxist thought and all that stuff. And there is a pedigree of you can see this idea influence this person and then this and that.
Sure.
And so when you understand that, it creates sort of a family tree of ideas.
Right.
And you want to talk a little bit about in the book that analogy, because I loved it.
Yeah. So the idea is that if you have, let's say you meet a woman at the park and she's blonde and blue-eyed, and her children are biracial. Okay, and they have black hair and brown eyes, and she says, "These are my children," and you would logically conclude, you'd say, "So is your husband black?" Because of course he is, right? Because that doesn't come out of nowhere. And with the Book of Mormon, I think people tend to look at writing or a book as it's just if you've never done writing. If you've never done it yourself, you look at a book and you think this is all just this big kind of mess, and you kind of look superficially at it. What are the characters saying and where are they going and blah, blah, blah. But if you've written a book before, you know that people talk certain ways, they use certain phrases. Ideas don't just pop out of nowhere. They come from somewhere, especially sequence of events. I try to lay out tables in my book to look at this sermon, not one line, but look at the whole structure and how it flows. Those things are unique characteristics, like DNA. If you're in a courtroom and they say, "Where were you the night of the 21st? Oh, I was here. This glove kind of matches your hand size. This knife is like the knives you have in your drawer." The judge is going to be like, "Yeah, okay, all right, no." But if some guy comes in and says, "We found your DNA at the crime scene,"
your unique feature,
right?
Something that is unique to you that
can't happen by chance.
It doesn't just happen by chance. That's showing up in it. And if I get where you're going with this, and this is something that Blake Ostler, he said something once and it just hit me. He said, the language of the Book of Mormon is clearly 19th century English, but the thought world is not.
Oh, that's excellent.
And he said the thought world of the Book of Mormon is ancient.
Excellent.
And when you actually get into what the thought world was, it is. And this is where, again, you can take the DNA and say Joseph Smith had a certain set of ideas in his head growing up in rural New York as a poor farm laborer. And then you look into the book and you go, the ideas in this book, he ain't the father.
Or not. Yes, but that's what you would say. You say, there's no way he's the father. No way that comes out of him. Because DNA, and this is what you do. At a crime scene, you find a little DNA, and it's unique. And so then you go test against other DNA, and you go, "Oh, I found a match." This is what I've done with the Book of Mormon. I went through all these apocryphal writings. I took samples of their ideas, their DNA, right? Their phraseology, the structure of the sermons and the stories and things like that. And I compare it to the Book of Mormon. And guess what? It's all over. There's hundreds of examples where the Book of Mormon authors appear to be quoting from, paraphrasing, or reading concurrently as they're writing from these apocryphal texts. These same apocryphal texts that claim to have been available to Lehi. These apocryphal texts date to before 600 BC. They could very well have been on the brass plates. There's an explanation for how they could have gotten there. You hear Nephi writing the sermon and you go, this is the assumption of Moses. It sounds like he's reading from it and then reciting it to his brothers right in the text.
So what you're saying is just like how we look at, and people do this, they look at the Book of Mormon and they say, this is biblical.
Yes.
This is from the Bible because I recognize this. Uh-huh. And what you're saying is if you come to understand the Apocrypha,
sure, you
would read a whole bunch of parts of the Book of Mormon and go, this is the ascension of Moses or whatever apocryphal work. And a lot of people have done that with a bunch of different things. But there was one in particular that you had. Now, there's a issue that I have had for a long time, or I won't say for a long time, but one of the more challenging sort of critiques of the Book of Mormon is that it contains New Testament ideas and or phraseology prior to the New Testament.
Right.
And I'll kind of give the example in your book that just hit me because it worked so well. So there is a phrase, full of grace and truth, that's used by Lehi.
Right.
Now,
2 Nephi chapter 2.
A person reading it goes, they see that and they go, oh, Joseph.
Oops.
Caught you, Joseph.
Gotcha.
You're referring to John, I think it's 1:14.
Right.
Because John 1:14 used that same language.
It's the exact same phrase.
We caught Joseph Smith using it.
Right. And that's a good question, right?
Yeah.
There's so many dumb questions about the Book of Mormon. That one you're like, oh, how did that get in there? Yeah. It isn't just an idea. Like, okay, fine. So you had an idea that God would save us. They had an idea that God would save us. That doesn't mean you copied from each other. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. But the exact same phrase?
Yeah.
You think, huh? And so in the book, I explore this idea that actually saying that someone is full of something appears nowhere in the scriptures. Nowhere in the Old Testament. There's never any instance of someone being full of grace, full of truth, or whatever. That's not an idea that they had. It never appears
in the
Old Testament.
In the Old Testament, in the traditional canon Old Testament.
Yes.
So from all appearances, if you just have the Bible, you're looking at the Bible and you go, look, you have the Bible, you have the Book of Mormon, you have the New Testament, Old Testament. You say, look, Joseph is pulling this phrase from John and he's inserting into the Book of Mormon. But
because apparently John was the first guy to say this. But
that's what you say that in the book, and I think it's one of the best parts of your book. You say, we assume that just because they said it, they were the first person ever to have said it.
Which is a weird assumption if you think about it.
Yeah, but people do that.
Yeah. I mean, authors, good preachers, good authors are always pulling from other places and sources to help their arguments. So it turns out, once we've discovered the Book of Enoch, translated into English, that phrase is in there. The idea that someone is full of grace and mercy and truth. The third Book of Enoch, second Book of Enoch, first Book of Enoch, these weren't found until a century after Joseph is dead, some of these texts. And they have this idea that that the Savior will be full of grace and truth, or full of light, or full of mercy. Okay? And they'll even say, full of grace and truth, just like John. So John was quoting from Enoch. He was quoting from lost traditions, and we didn't know it. We thought John just came up with the phrase. No. He was quoting from these lost texts, which would have been available to Lehi. And Lehi only starts using that phrase after he reads the brass plates. As a matter of fact, he uses that phrase in the same chapter that he says, I am reading from the brass plates. And then he describes the Savior just like Enoch would have described the Savior.
Now, I want to give some of the pushback as I see it that people might say.
Oh, bring it on, Jacob. Bring it on.
Is that people look at this and they go, okay, like you have this one example. And I'll even kind of, what I found, and this is the part of the book that I like, it's that any one of these, a person can kind of, maybe it's a good guess, just a coincidence here or there. But when you start seeing this over and over, from everything from specific phraseology to generalized themes and all of it, it becomes just remarkable. But I think a part of it that you hit on really well is you lay out this connection between the brass plates, which you're kind of getting into there, this connection between the brass plates and the Apocrypha.
Right.
And the idea that the brass plates were sort of like, they were part of that original good tradition that hadn't been corrupted, that we talked about Jesus was trying to reform something. That means at some point there was let's say
better,
a cleaner version of the religion that Jehovah was trying to implement into the world.
That's right.
And so the brass plates represent that. And that also makes sense now. It was, so many things start to make sense when you do this.
Yes.
The one that really made sense is the slaying of Laban. You go, this isn't just, we want to have a copy of the Old Testament with us. This is, we need to take with us the tradition, because the tradition is, it'd be like, the church is about to fall into apostasy, and you like get the writings that like hold it all together. Yeah. Yeah. And then you run away.
Well, and worse than that, it's people are remember, there weren't books on every shelf back then. People are coming. They're going to destroy the record or change the record. Like, you have to get this out. This is the only last time capsule. It's this metallurgical contingency plan. Right, against, it's like everything. It's like Star Wars, right? It's like when R2-D2 is in the escape pod and he's shooting away and he's got the plans in it, and the guy's like, hold your fire. There's no life forms on board. And you're like, are we charging by the laser beam right now? Like, we'll just shoot the thing. Why would we take that risk? It's weird. But anyways, that's what it was. It was this precious, these truths, the last place. And if you read the Apocrypha carefully, they tell this story that these truths were had and lost and fought against and restored and fought against and lost and restored again and again and again. And the prophets in the Apocrypha they're paranoid about their writings getting changed by wicked people, telling people, don't change these writings. You have to keep following these. Moses, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, these apocryphal records detail the old ancient prophets saying someday they're going to destroy this stuff. Someday they're going to get rid of this stuff. It was a concern. So you get to 600 BC, and the Lord says, this is the last remaining, surviving record that talks about these plain and precious truths, the fortunate fall, the suffering Messiah, etc., etc. We have to save these. So Laban, it wasn't just like we don't want to get caught, let's kill him and bury the evidence. It was you are the last obstacle to the preservation of the true gospel on earth.
It's so funny, because people who struggle with the story of Laban, when you end up realizing the stakes that were at hand and this idea of it's better that one man perish than that we lose this thing. Yeah. When you understand that the other part was about that there was going to be this time of they were going to take away. Now, there was one other part of the book that really hit me, and it was one of the specifics related to the history of what the brass plates had. Yes. Because you go into various sort of models to describe, and just so everyone knows, and I think you would want people to know this, this is your sort of argument and or theory and or model for how this plausibly took place.
Right.
And you lay out what in the apocryphal works, or at least I like to even maybe use apocryphal traditions, because the actual texts that we have today are very unlikely either the original text or the original traditions. They emerged from these traditions, let's say. And so what you are saying, though, is that some written form of these traditions existed within it, but then you point out that there's a bunch of stuff that isn't in the that is not in the brass plates, that don't show up, like conquests of like a lot of the Davidic stuff, like a lot of the history.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was super interesting.
You're trying to get me in trouble. You're going to get me in trouble. That's the controversial stuff. I mean, if it hasn't gotten controversial already. Yeah. So Joseph Smith, if you read the Book of Mormon so how do I start this? So for years, we've assumed that the 5 books of Moses, that the brass plates that Lehi took were just a metal copy of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That was the assumption, because we didn't know anything else. What else could they be? He says 5 books of Moses, and everybody goes, oh, we know what that is. The history of the Jews. Oh, sure, we know what that is.
That's like Samuel, Kings, Chronicles.
Everybody knows that, right?
Yeah.
So we thought, oh, it's the Old Testament. But then, if you actually read real carefully the Book of Mormon, you can find traces of those books. When they talk about Adam and Eve, obviously they are reading from Genesis. They talk about Moses on Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments, or the parting of the Red Sea. And you go, oh, that's Exodus. They talk about entry into Canaan. Oh, that's Numbers. Right? They talk about the forbidding of eating blood and those things. Oh, that's Leviticus. And Isaiah, that's Isaiah. They talk about these books, and you can draw a straight line and say, well, they must have had this book, check. Must have had this book, check. And compare it to the Old Testament. And there's a big hole where your check marks all stop. And it's from Deuteronomy to Chronicles. Now, Joseph Smith never said, now, if you'll notice in my book, there's a big hole. He never says this.
When you brought this up, I remember myself going, oh my gosh, you're right.
Yeah.
It only seems to refer to certain parts of the Old Testament, and then it's totally
silent
about
very glaring omissions.
Yeah.
Now, just so happens that 100 years after Joseph Smith was murdered, okay, a famous biblical scholar comes out and he says, you know, when I read this Old Testament, you know what I see? I see that there's a reform, a literary reform, and that from Deuteronomy to Chronicles is all one insertion. It's one post-fact insertion that a bunch of scribes wrote and shoehorned in. They squeezed it into the Old Testament. And he calls it the Deuteronomic history. Now, this is a well-known theory. It's accepted by most biblical scholars today, and it was first proposed in the 1930s and 1940s. And they said, and it was played with earlier than that, but they said this deuteronomistic history is an insertion that would not have been in there, but that these reformers took and squeezed in. Now, what's amazing is that's precisely where the Book of Mormon is silent. Now, that's how in the world?
Yeah, that's one of those levels of complexity, because when you look at the specifics, it's true.
It's true.
You can see that it doesn't. Now, somebody might say, well, maybe that's just the areas that were familiar to Joseph Smith, and so
really?
He wasn't familiar with
David?
That's the thing.
Solomon? Samson? Sorry, he wasn't familiar with David? If you were trying to write a book of forgery about an ancient Israelite tribe that broke off, David would be all over the thing.
Yeah,
Unless you're an idiot.
Oh, wait, were the Psalms? Yeah, the Psalms were...
No.
Yeah, there's the Psalms.
Job? Proverbs? Ecclesiastes? No.
Yeah, it's weird, because those are massive books
Yes.
in the Jewish tradition. In fact, and I think you bring this up in the book, that one of the critiques people make of the Book of Mormon is that it's not Jewish enough. Because it doesn't mention all of the Deuteronomic history. But when you notice that there's a pattern to it, that it's specifically only certain sections that later scholars end up finding out may not be original and may be later sort of, let's try and tell a better story of our history to center the power in Jerusalem.
Yes.
And then there's the other part of that is what begins to emerge in all of this for me in your book, and I think you do a great job of arguing for it, is there was this era pre-Babylonian captivity, pre-Book of Mormon, first temple Judaism and before,
Right.
where things were far less corrupted in Israel. And what you're seeing by the time of Lehi is the tail end of that era. The corruption is happening. This is for, people read the Book of Mormon. This is third Nephi at the beginning, or Book of Helaman.
Yep.
Like, it's all going downhill.
It all crumbles.
It's crumbling.
And right after they make these huge reforms that are written about, this giant religious reawakening that they do, the Josiah reforms, what they're referred to, and the Deuteronomists who insert that history, that those same scribes, right after they have their big day, right at the end, Babylon destroys them. So if I were just reading this and thinking, were those guys right in all their reforms? I'd say, apparently the Lord wasn't super happy about it, because right after they're done, the place is laid waste.
Well, and then Jesus shows up, and he's not exactly a fan of the Judaism that exists at that time. But what's interesting is that if you go back prior to the fall to the Babylonians and kind of the crumbling of the house of Israel, this is the documentary hypothesis is a very common hypothesis as to where the Old Testament came from.
Yes, we're not making this up.
Yeah.
We're not making this up. This is biblical scholars. We're talking about common biblical scholars.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest prevailing theory. And I remember when I read the theory, I found it very, very fascinating and compelling. And what it basically shows is that the books that we have today are a compilation of older traditions that through scribes, the people Jesus was upset with,
right,
that they cobbled together the traditions of their people. Because when I first heard, the Bible that we have today, the text we have today was likely compiled largely after the Babylonian exile.
Right.
I was like, wait a minute. I thought this was written way before that, long before that.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean those traditions didn't exist prior to that.
Sure, they're pulling from something, of course.
Exactly. So what we have in the actual text of the Bible is the Hebrew scribes who are cobbling together the tradition according to a particular power play in Jewish history. And it's like, wait a minute. So this is what the best biblical scholar points. Now, some people go, well, it's all a bunch of hogwash. It's just, Dan McClellan will pop in and be like, they're just writing to structure power according to that. But it's like, no, what they're doing is they are bastardizing an earlier tradition. But what if that earlier tradition is found and was preserved in the Book of Mormon? And what if we can demonstrate that?
We can detect it.
We can detect it because Joseph Smith restored these traditions through the Book of Mormon before any of these records were even available, before the documentary hypothesis was known. And what it shows is that biblical scholarship just more and more is showing that the narrative that Joseph in the Book of Mormon, and Joseph didn't even make this narrative.
He didn't even know he was making it.
He didn't know he was doing it.
Yes.
It's us just analyzing the book that he produced.
Right.
And as you say, examining its DNA and going, hold on, this now makes a lot more sense. And you
find out, wait, you're not the father. It's like you're looking through this DNA and you go, Mother Gothel, you're not her mother at all. And you can tell, you can look, you can compare them if you do it very carefully. And all these biblical scholars could have saved themselves a century of research. If they'd listened, if they've read the Book of Mormon, they could have saved themselves a century of research, because the Book of Mormon supports these hypotheses that now are popular, commonly accepted theories among the biblical scholars.
Same thing with you got all sorts of those things. You got that the ancient Israelite tradition, if you go further back, was not strictly monotheistic.
Oh, sure.
With Asherah and all this, there are all of these parallels that you start going, this is really, really weird. Even if Joseph was, quote unquote, making it up, it's like, how did he make it up?
Yeah. Now, for the antis listening to this who are just not listening and they're just ready for the next question, just to sum up, the Book of Mormon has traces of all the Old Testament books except this gaping hole and of course things written after Lehi would have left. But that gaping hole fits perfectly with now modern, commonly accepted biblical theories of how the Book of Mormon, how the Bible would have been compiled. It is copacetic. It fits perfectly. It doesn't contradict. As a matter of fact, it predated. Joseph Smith somehow was ahead of 100 years of the entire biblical scholarship global community. And he predicted it and didn't even know it.
And here's you're right. He never bragged about it. But what's even wilder is this. So people like to bring up the Deutero-Isaiah issue. Now, here's the thing. I will leave that to the scholars to try and sort out. But here's the thing. I came out of this when I realized what you had posited about all these things that are missing. I go, for some reason, somehow Joseph knew there should be Deutero Joshua, Deutero Chronicles. Remember, if the Old Testament was largely compiled, and I say largely compiled after Lehi left Jerusalem, then we should have all of that stuff that after Lehi left Jerusalem, that stuff should all be in there, and it should all be anachronistic, and it should just debunk the Book of Mormon hook, line, and sinker.
Easy, shouldn't it?
Okay?
Yes.
But for some reason, the only parts of the Old Testament that Joseph actually draws from, or in the Book of Mormon, or the Book of Mormon draws from, is the parts that did happen, that were compiled more anciently.
What a lucky guess.
And that's remarkable, because he should have stumbled right into that landmine.
Into that trap.
The moment he starts writing about these things that we clearly know came after the Babylonian exile, that's the whole point they bring up, because the only one that they might have found, where he might have goofed up, is Deutero-Isaiah.
Oh, well.
And there's good reason to believe.
And I'm sad I didn't put that in my book, because now looking back I'm like, that would have actually fit well.
But it's like there should be like 30 Deutero everythings.
Yes.
In there.
Right.
But they're not. And that is fascinating.
Yes.
And so I think we're starting to get close to where I think we want to try and summarize this. But
so the idea is that when you put all the pieces together, which I lay out the case in my book, these ancient lost books that New Testament authors, Old Testament authors referred to, quoted from, even the Lord himself. Now we're discovering these books that claim to be those books, that claim to be ancient, that were discounted from the canon.
Or at least claim to have emerged from those traditions.
From the same traditions, right?
Yeah.
To share DNA with them, okay? Now these books are coming forth, and they happen to match, to coincide with the Book of Mormon. Now, here's the impetus for the book that people might not know. Here's where I got the idea from the book, is that I had found a lot of these things in the Apocrypha. Great. Parallels with the Book of Mormon. I knew the Book of Mormon was true. But what was weird is that all these parallels just happened to show up in the Book of Mormon right when the authors were talking about the brass plates. I kept seeing this over and over and over again, is that they'd be giving a sermon and they'd say, by the way, I'm reading from the brass plates. And then they'd mention these golden gems that had correspondences in these lost books. And I thought, wait a minute. And you map them out and they fit together and you go, were these books or cousins of these books on the brass plates? What were the brass plates? And I started to ask that question. Could I reconstruct what was on the brass plates using some of these clues? And so that's kind of what the book ends with, is a reconstruction of what Lehi's brass plates would have been. So it gets pretty nerdy if you love that type of stuff, but it just further proves that Joseph Smith didn't even appreciate. He didn't even know. Yeah. He didn't even know how right he was. I didn't know how right he was. I thought I accepted the Book of Mormon as true. I had no idea how true it really was.
Yeah, I've had a very similar experience. Obviously, reading your book is one of them. A lot of people that are listening might be familiar with the correlations between the Book of Moses and the Book of Enoch. Which is
mind-blowing.
To
any honest observer.
Yeah, and I think I would probably put that in maybe the top place for evidences, if you want something that's a solid, evidence of Joseph Smith's inspiration. But what's really wild is that you're sort of taking that same logic of, here we have scripture that's produced by Joseph Smith correlating to things that in a complex and nuanced way that you end up walking away going, again, what it does, I think, more than anything, and this is our mutual friend, Austin Fife, with his Light and Truth letter, he likes to ask the critics some of the questions and turn it around. And I think that's the right thing to do. To say, look, you guys can ask me hard questions. Fine. We have answers that we give, and you can go to Fair Mormon and you can learn all about it. And we got all sorts of answers to questions. But I have questions for you.
Yeah. Explain this.
And I think your book is one of the biggest, explain this books out there, because it, and I want to measure the response here.
No, you shouldn't. No. Go hyperbolic. I love this. I'm loving this. The greatest book written in the LDS non-canonical library. You heard it here. Thank you. Tune in next time at Thoughtful Faith.
So what Jonah has done is put forth a really compelling theory and model for understanding the nature of the Book of Mormon, but not only the nature of the Book of Mormon, the nature of what Christ was trying to do as a restorer.
Yes.
The idea of a tradition that goes back before. If I were to sort of lay out the story that emerges, is that of, and I've had more glimpses of this, and your book helped to give it even more legs than my theory already sort of had. And that is that the Lord has been trying to establish his kingdom on the earth, and he's working with us, and we suck. And yes. And what happened is that this original sort of relationship with people and desire to sort of guide his people on earth through beginning with the house of Israel and the establishment of his kingdom amongst the families of Abraham and Moses and this house of people that he was trying to sort of guide. And what they do is they continually go sideways and stupid until eventually the tradition that was there, that was given, is corrupted.
Yes.
And politicized.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
the kingdom of God, which is not of this world, but that existed amongst these families, suddenly it is the nation state of Israel with our king.
Or Judah, yes, or Ephraim, yes.
And they centered it even more, you're right, because originally it was 12 tribes, and then it was like, no, it's Judah, it's us. Right. It's the Jews of the chosen people, which is only one of the 12 tribes. And so there's this constant centralization of power, and eventually it just gets so bad that the thing falls apart.
Right.
The Babylonian captivity happens, and then all that remains after that, after this steady stream of corruption, which, by the way, in that stream of corruption, there's the Old Testament. Everyone's like, Old Testament's awful. There's all this terrible stuff. Well, what if I was to tell you that a lot of the Old Testament is just a bunch of writings from power-hungry scribes who want to show themselves as glorious conquerors over Canaan and say, we murdered all those people, and that's awesome because we're right on, and God loved it. And it's like, these are corrupted writings. Do they still contain truth and principles? Why do we in the church spend less time focusing on the book of Leviticus than we do on the Book of Mormon? It's because they're not the same, right? And so we end up realizing that what we have here is an inspired tradition with lots of holes and flaws of a fallen people, and what you get out of the story is that they fell.
Yes.
And then
again and again, and I mean, it's the cycle that everyone goes through. It makes sense.
And then Christ comes to restore and fix, say, look, you guys, you scribes and Pharisees have messed it up. There is something good in this original with Abraham and Moses. And then
he says, let's get back to the truth. He doesn't say, all that old stuff's hogwash. Moses and Abraham, forget all that. Let's move on to part 2. No, he says, let's get back to part 1. This is corrupt. He was a restorer, not a reformer.
And that restorer of Christ, obviously more than a restorer, but he does this, he restores it, and then again the process of corruption begins, and the restoration of the gospel is, in our day, is again a hailing back through the Book of Mormon to the brass plate tradition, to the truths taught by Jesus Christ, and they form this collective prophetic witness of this is what God is trying to do on earth. We're trying to give the full vision, and again, it's like all of a sudden so many things start snapping into place.
Start to snap into place. Yep. They start to fit.
And where this confusing narrative of kind of like just what you brought up. Jesus, why didn't he just come in and be like, Judaism, that's stupid. I got something to, like, he was like faithful to it still.
Yes.
And so
he was trying to get back to it. And we mistake that. Christians mistake that so terribly. And they say, Jesus was a reformer. It's like, no, he was a restorer. He wasn't trying to come up with something new. He was trying to go back to things that were old. Yeah. He was trying to go back. And another kind of last problem, and maybe we don't have time to talk about this right now, but is that the mission of the Book of Mormon changes. The Book of Mormon wasn't just supposed to preserve truths against the great apostasy. It was to preserve truths against two apostasies, two large apostasies. It doesn't go back to 29 AD or like 1 BC to preserve the truth that was kept right there. Lehi didn't leave Jerusalem in 1 BC. He left in 600 BC.
And there's that's another fascinating thing about the restored gospel. The restored gospel, even Joseph Smith, it isn't just a restoration of the Christian church circa, 35 AD.
Right. You're right.
The restored gospel, Joseph Smith immediately goes to the Old Testament, to the oldest book.
Yeah, how weird. Why would you do that?
Yeah, why aren't you just trying to restore? And that's what most Christians were doing. Most Christians who had restorations, we need to get back to New Testament Christianity.
Yes.
Joseph Smith goes in and starts going into Old Testament temple stuff. And we have this weird connection with Judaism that most of the Christians kind of like, yeah, Judaism, nah. It's kind of like, nah. We're like, we have this very different narrative.
You're right.
Of sort of like, there was a original picture that was perverted, restored, went through all the issues of its own birth. But now in the latter days, we have a new witness that hails back to these traditions. And anyway, I always say to everyone, look, even the things I say when I have these sorts of theories and models and ideas, look, I'm giving you a model and a framework for trying to understand this. I'm not putting this forth as absolute truth. But I love to take a look at different ways of looking and trying to make sense of things. And I just think your book does a fantastic job of putting forth just a new way to look at this history that is consistent with what the church teaches. I don't think there's anything in here that's going to take you off into some crazy country where I'm going to have to make videos about you leading people astray.
Not yet.
Not yet.
When they ban Dr. Pepper, that'll be the day. Then you'll have to deal with me apostatizing.
Exactly. Me too. And anyway,
but it's consistent with the teachings of the church, and it's consistent with biblical scholarship. There's a lot of scholars who thumb their nose at the Apocrypha, but actually what my book hopes to show is that biblical scholarship actually agrees with the theory pretty well. It aligns very well. A lot of faithful people lose their faith because they start looking into biblical scholarship and it crushes them. And we have a very unique advantage in that we can open the Bible with critical eyes as much as we want. We can learn the languages and we can learn the stories and how the documents were compiled and the canonicity and all that stuff. We can learn all that with no fear. That is a crazy, unique part of our gospel. A lot of Christians, they go off to college, they go off to seminaries, they get their theological degrees, and they lose their faith. They learn about how this was all put together and they say, this is a mess, because they have biblical inerrancy and all these things about how the canon was put together. We're circling back to the beginning here. But the Church of Jesus Christ, we from the first page, the Book of Mormon says, it's making bold claims. It's saying, forget everything you know. The gospel was preached since Adam. The Messiah was preached since Adam. And here's the fullness. The Book of Mormon is not another testament of Jesus Christ. I wish I could change that. The Book of Mormon is the original testament of Jesus Christ. It predates the Bible. It predates the New Testament by 600 years. It predates the Old Testament by 100 years. The Book of Mormon is the OG testament of Jesus Christ. And that is a bold claim that Joseph was making. And so we can read without fear. We can research all this stuff without fear. And so I hope that people love the book. I hope they get the book. It's wonderful to hear somebody read my book. No one's ever read my book before. Even my wife has never read it before. So this is great to hear somebody who actually read it and who didn't say, this is crap. You actually really liked it. So.
No, and I want everyone to go get the book because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think this is going to start a big conversation. I think the Apocrypha is back, baby.
Oh yeah, great.
We're making the Apocrypha great again in the sense of, and again with
you heard it here, MAGA.
With every caution of remembering that these are books that are like don't go out and get crazy, but you can use the Book of Mormon and the Bible together to triangulate within the Apocrypha things that really stand out.
To triangulate. That's a good word.
Because when you have both the reference points, you can begin to expand what you understand about these ancient records. And it just testifies to the truthfulness of what the Book of Mormon is teaching to what the church is teaching. I'll give you the final word.
Final word, I talk about it like a tether. If you're a young boy learning to scuba dive or snorkel or something, and there's rocks and there's shoals and there's coral and there's sharks and things, you don't go very far from shore. But if you have a tether or a friend holding on a rope or something, now you're more brave. Now you'll go and you'll explore a little more because you have this tether. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the kingdom of God on the earth, is led by real prophets, apostles, seers, revelators. And they have the keys of the priesthood to hold together the truths in the latter days. That was the last apostasy. We're done. Last restoration. We've got it here. If you hold to that tether, then you can read anything you want. You can read the Apocrypha without fear. If it says something contradictory to the restored gospel, to the brethren, then okay, well, this is one of those crazy things that just kind of came up, and you can that's fine. But you're brave enough that you can sift through the crazy stuff, and you're not afraid it's going to sink you. You're not afraid it's going to bite you, because you have the tether of the Book of Mormon and the restored gospel. So hold to that tether and explore away and read all this stuff. And it's fun stuff, including my book.
Well, thank you so much, Jonah. It has been absolutely awesome. I am excited we got through the first ever interview in this space, and hopefully we'll have many more, but thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.